guys, today we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, and we're going to start off talking about some of the more natural processes that go into that cycle, and then later on we're going to be looking at some of the human impacts for that cycle. So let's just review a few things really quickly here. So remember that on Earth we kind of consider it an open system in terms of energy, because energy can come into Earth and it can also leave and be lost back into space. But matter, it's really more of a closed system. Matter, for the most part, really does not leave Earth, and it does not really come in any quantity from outer space. So that means that matter has to cycle around over and over again, because that amount of matter is limited because of that whole law of conservation of mass. So there's a couple important background things here that you're going to need to know to understand what's going on. So the first thing is a few terms related to different systems that we can look at in Earth. So a lot of times we will refer to one of these systems when we're talking about cycles or when we're talking about things that are happening on Earth. So you need to know about these three major spheres that make up the abiotic environment. So all the non-living things are kind of grouped into one of these three categories. They're either in the hydrosphere, so that would include all of the water on the world. So that would include things like ponds and lakes, which we've already talked about a little bit, the oceans, obviously, rivers and that sort of thing. But it would also include clouds and anywhere that the water is cycling around. Most of the time you're going to think of it as a body of water, though. The atmosphere you want to think of as the layer of gases that are surrounding the planet. So that one's pretty easy to picture. Most of you have an idea of that in your head. We're going to go into a lot more detail in later units of what that atmosphere is made up of, the different chemicals that are there, but for now just think of it as all the gases. And then the geosphere is the land itself. And that doesn't just include the surface of the land and the things that are there like forests or deserts or whatever that is, but it also includes under the ground. So all of the minerals that are underground, all of the soil and everything like that would all be included in the geosphere. And then the last piece here is the biosphere. And the biosphere isn't just one distinct area, because it's all of the living things in the ecosystems. So all of those living things interact with all these other three spheres. A lot of those living things live in water, so they're in the hydrosphere. A lot of them are going to be flying around in the atmosphere, or at least breathing the air from the atmosphere. And they're very closely connected with the geosphere as well. So when we go through these cycles, we're going to be talking about how things move through these different spheres. Now, when we start to look at these different spheres, we notice that we see certain elements over and over again. So if you look at the geosphere and just the Earth's crust itself, it's made up of only about 8 major elements. And same thing if you start looking at other parts of these different areas as well. You see these same elements over and over and over again. So we were introduced to this in your homework last time with this acronym of CHNOPS. And this acronym basically says that carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur are our most abundant elements that we need for life. You went over why we needed all that already. So each of these are going to be involved in the cycles that you need to know. So these are the major kind of cycles that you need to know. And the one exception that's not up here is sulfur. You'll need to know that one as well. So carbon and oxygen, we're going to kind of group together into one cycle. We're usually going to refer to it as the carbon cycle. And then hydrogen and oxygen will also kind of be grouped together into the water cycle. Then we'll have a nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. And we're going to go through all of these in the coming weeks. So when we talk about cycles, they are basically systems. So just like any other system, they're going to have inputs and they're going to have outputs. So we're going to have molecules that are being added to the system and molecules that are leaving or going to a different part of the system, in other words. And it's all kind of like balancing a budget. You want to make sure that you wind up with the same amount coming in that you have going out, so that you have a nice even ecosystem that is very healthy. Now, it doesn't mean that you'll always have the same amount of, say, carbon in every single one of those spheres that we mentioned. You might have more carbon being stored in certain places, like in the ground or in the atmosphere. But it needs to stay at whatever level is kind of naturally balanced in order for everything to be healthy. So when we talk about these, there's a couple important vocabulary terms that we have to keep in mind, and they have to do with these inputs and outputs. So these two terms are sink and source. And a sink is basically any sort of either process or any part of the environment that's going to take in more of an element than it releases. So here I've just used element X, and that's just a variable. So that would be one of those CHNOPS elements that we're talking about, or it could be a molecule like water that's cycling around. And if there is a certain process that soaks that molecule up, then that would be a sink for that molecule. It's going to hold on to it and keep it there, and kind of keep it from moving into any other area. So these are also called reservoirs, and that's what they were called in your last homework. So it's the same thing, basically, a reservoir and a sink. Except that usually when we say a reservoir, we're talking about a specific part of the environment, like one of those spheres. And sinks can be processes too, things like photosynthesis, things like that. All right, and then the opposite of a sink is a source. So a source is going to release more of whatever element or molecule it is than it takes in. So it's going to put more back out somewhere. And we want these to be balanced too. We want to make sure that we have an equal amount of whatever element it is, whether it be carbon or nitrogen, etc., coming in as we do going out. We want everything to kind of be even and naturally balanced. And nature has it set up this way in the first place. So you do need to know some of the forms that you can find carbon in the environment, and these are the major ones. So carbon dioxide obviously makes up a lot of the air. It can also be found dissolved in pretty much any form of water. So that could be rainwater, that could be in the oceans, that could be any system of water that you have will have some carbon dioxide in it. Then you have carbonic acid, and we're going to see that this is actually what forms when you have carbon dioxide mixing with water. It reacts and it forms carbonic acid, and this gives off those H plus ions. And if you think back to biology, that's actually what makes something acidic, is those hydrogen ions. You should be seeing that in chemistry as well. So these hydrogen ions make this a weak acid, and that's a form that can be found especially in the oceans. Then you have carbonates. Carbonates are sedimentary rocks. They're a mineral, actually, a part of the rock. So that would include things like limestone that has carbonate in it. A lot of shells of organisms, and the coral skeleton itself is made up of calcium carbonate also, which is basically the same chemical as limestone. So you can see your carbon in there. And then, of course, we have fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are compounds that we call hydrocarbons. So that just means they have hydrogen and carbon together. And a lot of times you're going to see them kind of written in this formula. And here the X and the Y are variables, so we might have different amounts of carbon and different amounts of hydrogen. And I have a little star there because sometimes there could be some other elements too, and it's still a hydrocarbon if it's a long carbon chain. So these molecules contain lots of energies because all of those carbon-hydrogen bonds can be broken and you can get energy out. And that's why we use them as fossil fuels, because they have so much potential for energy. But we're going to find there's going to be some problems with that as well. And then biomass is also basically in the same realm of hydrocarbons. These are organic compounds. They have carbon and hydrogen in them, and that's what makes them organic. So these are the things you talked about in biology, like carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And just a little recap real quick. Remember that you need carbs for quick energy for your body, and they also make up plant cell walls. Proteins would be kind of the worker molecules for your body. They do all the work, like enzymes that speed up reactions. They also are the molecules that make up most of your structure, like your hair, your nails, your muscle, all of your cells. And then lipids are going to help you store energy over the long term. They also act as hormones. They provide insulation and waterproofing. They do a bunch of important things for you. And nucleic acids are going to be things like DNA that are going to store your genetic material. So no living thing can really live without these different types of compounds. And these organic compounds all make up part of that biomass that we've been talking about, the mass of their living body, once we take away all the water. So that's all a major place that we find carbon as well. And of course, once those organisms die, that biomass becomes detritus, or that dead organic matter, and that still has carbon and hydrogen in it. And then decomposers are going to start to break that down back into its individual molecules again, so that can eventually be turned back into carbon dioxide into the air and then taken up again by plants. Now, one last place just to kind of mention that a lot of times you will also have carbon compounds left in fossils somewhere along the fossilization process. So that's another place that we can find it in some cases. All right, so now that we know all the different forms that carbon can come in, let's start looking at our carbon cycle. So sometimes you might hear this called the carbon-oxygen cycle, because usually I'd say about half the time when we're talking about carbon in this case, we're talking about carbon dioxide. So the oxygen is very deeply involved in this as well. Now this is a super complex cycle, and you're going to find there's lots of different parts to it. But it's so important. All of life depends on it. It even involves dead things that contain carbon. So really everything we're studying in the ecosystem is going to be somehow involved in this carbon cycle. And when we start to look at this carbon cycle, we see that there's many parts to it. So we're going to focus today on some of the natural parts of this carbon cycle. So the biological parts, and we're also going to focus on the parts that are more part of the abiotic environment. All right, so as we go through this, we're going to see that there are three major parts to this carbon cycle. Number one is the geologic carbon cycle, and I'm going to have you break for this in just a minute and go watch a video from Howard Hughes Medical Institute that's going to explain that to you a little bit more. The second part is the biologic carbon cycle, and we've already talked about that a lot. So that's that cycle of photosynthesis and respiration. And remember, that's going on both on land and in the ocean. Everywhere you have a food web, you have this biologic carbon cycle. So that also includes things like decomposition. Remember that decomposition is really just another form of respiration. Organisms are just getting energy a different way. And that includes all the food web stuff we just finished up talking about as well. Now, what we're going to find is our third part is all the ways that humans impact the carbon cycle. And we're doing this quite significantly. We're doing it through three major ways. The first way, and probably the way we're going to spend the most time on, is combusting fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, and adding CO2 that way. But we also add CO2 when we burn biomass. When we burn things like wood, that's also adding to that issue. Also, when we make cement or remove carbon from soil or from underground for any other reason, that's going to impact our carbon cycle. And the last way we're going to impact it is through deforestation, taking away the forests, cutting them down, and also using that land for other reasons. Usually we're cutting down forests to use them for agriculture. When we do that, we do a couple of things to the carbon cycle. First of all, we've reduced the amount of photosynthesis that's happening, because now you don't have those trees there anymore to photosynthesize. So you're removing less CO2 from the atmosphere than you were for that reason. So of course the primary productivity is going to go down because you have less photosynthesis. However, there's another thing that's also going on here, where we are still encouraging photosynthesis because we're growing our crops, but we're basically harnessing all of that primary productivity and keeping it for ourselves. So all of those plants that are being grown are going towards humans instead of going towards the entire ecosystem as a whole. So even though we might not seem like we're cutting back on photosynthesis that much, we are taking it out of the natural system at that point. So it really hurts the productivity of the system. All right, I'd like you to break here for a minute, and I'd like you to go to the other site that I gave you and follow along with the questions. Watch his little lecture there, and he's going to tell you all about the geologic carbon cycle. And then when you're all done, join me back here. Alright, so hopefully you were able to get a basic idea of what that geologic carbon cycle is. I know it's complicated. It's always the hardest part for kids to kind of grasp, and we're going to do a little lab later on with this that should help us to understand this a little bit more. But here's the two pictures that I really like, this one and this one. So let's go through these real quick, and I think this will help you to see what's happening here. So when we have volcanoes, we have this igneous rock that's coming out of them. We're going to talk a lot more about rocks in a later unit. But basically, it's bringing up in this molten rock some carbon dioxide. And it's releasing that carbon dioxide as a gas into the air. Once the carbon dioxide gets into the air, it combines with rain and it forms carbonic acid. Now this is a weak acid, but it does make the rain slightly acidic. So as that rain rains down, there are going to be certain rocks that are going to be prone to reacting with that weak acid. So things like limestone. And then that acid is going to weather the rock. It's going to break it down. And the sediments are going to be carried down the rivers. So that would include the carbon at that point. And that also includes the rock itself, the little bits of the rock. And it winds up in the ocean. And there, that carbon is used to form animal shells in the form of calcium carbonate. And when the animals die, the shells sink to the bottom, they get compacted over long periods of time, and eventually they form limestone again. So we get back to a rock again. And then those rocks eventually can do what we call subduct and kind of sink down into the magma inside the earth. And again, we'll come back to this in a later unit. And that limestone will basically turn into molten rock again. And then guess what? It can come back up through the volcano. So it's all cycling back. So here's another picture that shows basically the same thing. This one focuses a little bit more on the silicate side of things rather than just the carbon side. So again, you're releasing the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In this case, it may not be coming down in rain alone. It's also going to dissolve into the ocean. So every time the waves go by, they're mixing with the CO2 in the air, and some of it is dissolving. And between the rainfall with the carbonic acid and the CO2 that's naturally dissolving, you wind up with a lot of carbon compounds in the water. And again, anytime you have a carbon compound and you have a silicate mineral that's kind of vulnerable to reacting with that, it's going to react and it's going to form these carbonate rocks. And those form on the bottom of the ocean, and again, then they're going to subduct, they're going to be taken back into the magma and released back up by volcanoes and such again. So here's just one other way of showing that. And the reason why I like this one, I know there's kind of a lot going on here, but this really shows you all the sources of carbon dioxide here. So you can see the sources are basically coming from underground in this case, and it shows you all the sinks, all the places where the carbon's being taken back in. So it's being taken back in to the oceans, it's being taken back in when these organisms form their shells. And it also shows you here the two major reactions that are going on. So when they go in one direction here, this is really the weathering process, the breaking down of rocks. And then when we talked about how the rock will sink back in and form magma again, that part is really the metamorphism part. And we'll come back to the rock cycle later, but everything's being pressed down on and melting and mixing back together. The other thing that I like that this points out is that this is a feedback cycle. It's something that happens on millions of years time scale. So it's not going to adjust the climate of the Earth in a quick enough time for us to really notice. But it does mean that if the temperature starts going up or down too much, eventually this is going to help to regulate it again. And that's part of what he was talking about in that video. So if you can take that away, then you're in good shape. All right, now we said the geologic carbon cycle, that's the first natural part. The second natural part of this cycle is the biologic carbon cycle. So whereas this is talking about all the abiotic things, and this geologic carbon cycle would happen whether or not there were living things here, it would be going on anyway, with the exception of maybe not having the animal shells. The biologic carbon cycle is all about living things, and this is what we've been talking about already, and this is what we've been showing in those food chains and trophic pyramids. Just remember that basically how this starts off is energy comes in from the sun and gets captured by the chloroplasts in plants, and then they're using that as well as carbon dioxide and water, and remember it's that CO2 that's really important here. They're taking that in and they're turning these molecules into sugars, and they're doing that to make food for themselves. So they make these sugars and then they use those sugars for their own purposes. They use them for energy or to build up their bodies, and then they also can kind of pass on those sugars to animals when the animals eat them for food. And here's where your food chain comes in, because then those sugars and also the energy would kind of travel up that food chain, again losing a lot of it as you go, but still keeping some. A lot of that carbon dioxide, as we talked about in class, is being lost by breathing it back out into the atmosphere. And you go right up the trophic levels, and then eventually at every single step here, that CO2 is going back to the atmosphere through breathing out, and it gets back to the plants all over again. Now remember that decomposition is really just respiration, so it's still following the same formula. We're taking that glucose and oxygen, we're breaking it down and making water and carbon dioxide in order to get energy, which is the whole point. So the only difference here is that you have a different kind of niche going on. You have detritivores and saprotrophs using respiration to break down organic matter so that they can get energy. It's just a different approach to getting energy rather than hunting something or being an herbivore. And remember, the big difference here is that the saprotrophs are going to absorb those nutrients kind of outside of themselves like a fungus, whereas the detritivores might be something more like a scavenger. So one thing I want you to notice about this process is that respiration takes oxygen. So this is going to be important later on when we talk about some of our other cycles. Whenever you have a lot of respiration in an area, it's taking oxygen out of that area. And that's why in those eutrophic lakes that we mentioned, those lakes with too many nutrients, that's why they have these anoxic zones, these zones with very low dissolved oxygen, because that oxygen has been taken away from the process by the process of respiration. And it's taken away when those algae cells die off and decompose. Those decomposers break it down using oxygen, they use it all up, and then there's no oxygen left for all of the other organisms that need it in order to make their energy. So just remember, this is happening all the time. In the oceans, on land, you have photosynthesis, you have respiration, decomposition, which is just another form of respiration, and that's forming that biologic carbon cycle. Now, we do want to mention some overall sinks and sources for carbon. So when we talk about carbon reservoirs, we usually talk about them in four major ways. We want to talk about the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the lithosphere. And the lithosphere here is just kind of another word for geosphere, and we'll get into some of the details with how they are a little bit different later on, but for now I just need you to know that they're very similar. Okay, so if we look at where we find carbon, we find a lot of it in the atmosphere. And in the atmosphere, it's usually either in the form of carbon dioxide or methane, CH4. And do you need to know your formulas here? These are both greenhouse gases. They're going to help trap heat in, and we're going to talk more about this later as well. Then the biosphere, you have all that carbon held up in that organic material, kind of tied up in the organisms' bodies, in the detritus, in all the biotic parts of the soil and everything else that's there. In the hydrosphere, you have the carbon dioxide dissolved in the water. And remember, this is the reaction that takes place when that happens. Some of that carbon dioxide is going to react with water and it's going to form carbonic acid. So when it gets dissolved in the ocean, that carbonic acid is actually going to cause what we call ocean acidification. We'll be talking about that more later on as well. And it's also going to dissolve in the rainwater, and that makes even normal rainwater have a pH of 5.6. So this is not acid rain, this is just your typical, everyday, completely natural rainwater. And carbonic acid is a really weak acid, so you can notice it's not too far below neutral. Um, what really becomes a problem with acid rain are other types of acids, like those that form from nitrous oxides or sulfur oxides, because then it forms nitric or sulfuric acids, which are much stronger and are going to lower your pH much more. Carbonic acid, not too bad, so normal rainwater 5.6. Then in the lithosphere, our sinks are our sediments, where all of those carbon atoms are collecting at the bottom. Fossils would also count here. All of the lava and magma that we talked about with that carbon silicate cycle. And all that weathering process. So that whole video that you watched is kind of talking about what's going on in the lithosphere. Right? So carbon gets released into the atmosphere in a lot of different ways, and these are all really your sources of carbon that you might be adding things to the atmosphere with. So one major way is that respiration from plants and animals, and of course when decomposition happens, same process. Also, we're going to release carbon dioxide whenever we burn organic material, combustion. So either we can be burning biomass, which is when we burn wood or sugar cane or anything like that, or biofuels, or we could be burning fossil fuels. And either way, we're releasing carbon. When we produce cement, we release carbon. And when the ocean is just kind of going along doing its normal business, it is also releasing carbon into the atmosphere through the process of diffusion. If you remember from biology, molecules are always going to move from where there's a higher concentration to where there's a lower concentration. And it happens faster at a warmer temperature because those molecules are moving around quicker, and it's easier for that carbon dioxide to escape out of the water and into the atmosphere. So that's constantly happening at the surface of the ocean. Whenever it's moving around, it's releasing CO2. And another way that we're releasing CO2, as we mentioned earlier, is through these volcanic eruptions and any kind of movement in the Earth's crust that's going to let it out as well. So these are all the ways that kind of counteract that. All right, so if these are all of our sources or our source processes, then these are all of our sink processes, the ones that are going to take the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. So our big one, which probably you already know, is photosynthesis. That's taking most of our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, fixing it into a form where it's kind of stuck. And chemosynthesis technically does this too, but it does it in way smaller amounts than photosynthesis. Now, a couple other things are also going on. If the seawater cools down, then that means more carbon dioxide will dissolve. So that's going to take in more. Diffusion's going to speed up. And also in the upper layers of the ocean, in any shallow waters, you're going to have organisms that are taking carbon and they're turning it into their calcium carbonate shells. So they're taking in the atmospheric carbon dioxide also. And altogether, this forms a natural balance. And you can see that the numbers aren't even. It's not like you have the exact same amount of carbon everywhere. But this is the normal process of things. And you want everything to stay about in these ratios so that everything is nice and healthy and balanced with each other. And we did mention that part of this process is fixing that carbon. And when we say fixing, we mean kind of making it stick in one place. So getting it stuck so that it stays in living things, or getting it stuck underground. So the process of photosynthesis actually fixes that carbon and it gets it kind of stuck in our food chain so that it's not out in the atmosphere anymore. Now it's in those living things. And this is a really important part of the negative feedback cycle that's going on here. These plants are photosynthesizing and they're removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that can actually help to reduce the greenhouse effect because we're taking away a greenhouse gas that helps the temperature go down. Now, as temperatures go down, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere actually naturally rise because photosynthesis is dependent on temperature. So when temperature goes down, photosynthesis goes down, you have more CO2. But when you have more CO2, that's going to cause the temperature to rise, that's going to cause photosynthesis to happen faster, and that CO2 is going to be taken back out again. So this is a negative feedback cycle because it's kind of correcting itself. And that's what we want to happen in the carbon cycle, is we want everything to sort of correct itself and go back to normal. And we want our sources and our sinks to be balanced so that everything is in its natural sort of process. All right, so what we're going to be talking about coming up here is all the ways that humans are impacting this carbon cycle. Because as you know, if you've heard anything about climate change, we're adding CO2 in the atmosphere overall. And we're adding it at a rate that's really impacting a lot of things, including our temperature. And that's because all these inputs and outputs, all these sources and sinks that traditionally were very well balanced naturally by these processes, we're adding more sources now basically, and we're taking away from the sinks, and that's causing the whole level of carbon in the atmosphere to go up. So that's kind of where we're going from here. Please come see me if you have any questions about that, and I'll see you next class.